Hello, Rhys.
Hello, Marian.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me to record here in your home.
Yes, here in the west side of Melbourne, Australia.
Beautiful. And we'll speak about change.
Yes, sounds good.
Yeah. And what empathy has to do with change.
Absolutely. Change is all about people, so how do we work with those people and help them be facilitated by a great change process?
Yes. And who likes change?
Not many people.
At least not the change that we haven't initiated ourselves, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I've been observing, lots of organisations do cultural surveys, and every organisation in the world scores really low on change, pretty much. And so it's this kind of funny thing that, no one seems to think they do change well, and they find change stressful and frustrating, but it is such a constant, we can't get rid of it. It's here, it's always here.
And I read once that the most successful change projects are those that communicate what remains the same.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, those sorts of things give people a sense of, there is some stability, something to actually hold on and kind of go, okay, well, it's not, the whole world isn't ending, we do still have something that we can rely on.
Yeah. And before hitting the record button, you're sharing some insights about the project you're currently working on. And you mentioned that the internal discussion whether to start the change process already or whether to wait until the change is really happening.
Yeah.
And what are the pros and cons of preparing an organization slowly that change will happen versus ripping the Band-Aid off and just initiating the change right away?
I'd say it depends on the change itself, obviously, but I think it's kind of when you have people sitting in uncertainty, and so if you have a change that you can do where you can go, all right, here's what it's going to look like, here's what we're trying to change, here's what we're trying to achieve, and do that pretty quickly, sometimes that can be better than spending more time doing the planning and working out who we're going to engage in what order and what time. Because ultimately it's that sort of, when people are sitting there waiting, wondering what's going to happen, they start thinking about the worst and start imagining that it's possibly going to be so much bigger than it really will be.
True, which reminds me of one thing that we dislike even more than change, which is uncertainty.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
Because people want a sense of control. And if you are creating a change, you're driving a change, that can be quite empowering because there's something that you're in control. You've kind of, you're the one doing it. But if it's kind of happening to you, we look at the COVID experience that we've all been through. That was a change that was monumental, and actually probably the worst bit of it was the uncertainty of initially, what is this? What does it mean? And you're kind of sitting there a little bit scared because you don't know how bad this virus is going to be, or you don't know how you catch it or how it's transmitted. There's so much uncertainty around how it transmits. And then once we kind of worked that out a bit, you were still a bit oh, if I go out in this place, is that going to be safe? It was that sort of stress of the unknown that was kind of the big factor.
Yes, and I'll come back to the stress factor in a second. I was just thinking back of a conversation I had with Steph Clark, and she mentioned the pandemic as an example that there was so much pain that actually people were, and we talked about learning and development and training, so the pain was so big that people were actually happy to change because the pain of staying the same was higher than the pain to change.
Yeah.
And now being back from this extraordinary case of COVID, suddenly we're back to the case where change might be more painful than staying the same.
Absolutely. I was thinking about this, and we had pretty hard lockdowns in Melbourne, and there was a pretty long period of time where things were probably from paper back to normal. We could go out, we could go to events, we didn't have to wear masks everywhere, but I was still probably living like I did during lockdown, where I was kind of I don't really want to go to nightclubs and I don't want to go to places with heaps of people. I'm still going to wear a mask if I'm in a crowded space, which obviously is the right health advice, but was still kind of really hesitant to engage in life in the way that I had pre-pandemic.
Yeah. And that's so interesting because I had a similar behavior that I wouldn't go out as before pandemic and engage as before pandemic. And I think for me it wasn't even because of the fear of catching the virus, but rather the change, the behavioral change of not being used to crowds anymore. Yeah. So that it was more the social anxiety than the health
and
anxiety.
I'm not used to that like human interaction that we used to just do all the time. Like I've had probably 2 examples recently where I've been in a public environment, maybe going to a show or going to something, and you make eye contact with people in the crowd, and I looked at someone and then sort of looked away, and then I kind of went, hang on a minute, I know that person. But by that point, I'd already blanked them, and they'd kind of gone, oh well, they'd kind of walked off. And it was as if this muscle of recognizing people in public was just weakened.
And what does that actually mean for employees coming back to the workspace? Because, I mean, we're talking about the change of the lockdown, the change that's coming now from a restructuring process. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But what about the change of coming out of lockdown and basically coming back to the office and not being used anymore to the small chit-chat, the interaction?
Absolutely. I was reading some research this week which was talking about actually working from home is not the amazing thing that we thought it was. Like, there's so many elements of it that do benefit our mental health in a really good way, but there's a lot of parts of it that are really negative and really detrimental to our mental health. And we've got to try and work out the balance. Like, as humans, we need interaction with people, and that's a really good thing for us. And we need incidental exercise, like that walk to the train station and then the walk to the office is actually really good for us. And it's not the same as walking to the fridge and then back to,
What?
Yeah, and so there's all these kinds of little elements of the old world of pre-COVID and working in an office that's really good, and being with people and sort of having face-to-face interactions, like all that stuff's really, really awesome. But then, on the flip side, there's like all these other elements that we've learned to embrace, being able to put washing on during a meeting, or like unload the dishwasher, just go off camera and off you go. And so trying to kind of work out how do we like maintain these good elements of perhaps if we're able to work remotely, with the change of going back into the office and trying to engage as humans again. How do we manage both of those things?
Yeah, and what kind of stress elements are actually involved in that? I remember, again, before hitting the record button, you mentioned the study about different elements that add to stress, and one of the surprising ones was that going on holidays can be a stress factor. And I'm just thinking of meeting someone face to face in the office. It's also some sort of uncertainty. Going to the office, I'm not in control who I will meet and how it will be.
And where they've been and who they've interacted with.
Exactly, what kind of questions they're going to ask me.
Yeah.
So what is expected? So these small kind of stressors that we lost the habit of actually coping with.
Yeah.
I haven't been aware of that and how it could tie us then to stay home, believing that it's better for us because it feels safe.
Yeah.
Although actually it's not.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that study, I think it's called the Holmes-Rahe Stress Inventory, and I came across it when I was studying change at university. And at the start of that semester, I'd gone through some pretty horrible change. I had someone close to me had died, and I was going through a lot. I messaged my tutor to say, "Hi, I'm having a stressful time. Here's why. I may or may not be super engaged, and if I'm not, like, there's the reason." And I mean, sometimes you have particularly wonderful teachers, and this one was so accommodating, but even to the point where, like, before certain classes, she'd email me and say, "Okay, here's the stuff we're covering this week. Here's what I imagine could be potential trigger points. If this is going to be, we can work together. If you want to come, we can work through that. If you need to step out, that's fine. If you don't want to turn up and you want to learn in a different way, we can facilitate that." And it was extraordinary. But I did go along, and let's make sure this doesn't turn off. We had this discussion about stress, and it was kind of, it was a change course. So we were looking at like how does change impact people, and we started off with this stress test or stress measurement. So it kind of had this whole list of different events and different things that can happen to an individual, and then it had a kind of number attached to each one. So obviously things like someone close to you dying, or losing your job, like those sorts of things rated really, really highly, and when you add them together, it sort of said, actually, if you've got a high number accumulatively over a year, you've got a much higher risk of having a negative health impact.
Mm-hmm.
So it was recognising that cumulative stress can have a really big impact on health, not just mental health, actual physical health. And so kind of looking at that, there were also things which were surprising, like going on holidays was like, I can't remember what the number was, but it was a contributor to stress, because if you think about it, that's a change to your routine, it's a change to your environment, your location. We do see holidays as a really positive change and something that you're usually trying to look forward to, but often the lead up to a holiday, you're maybe rushing to finish all the work so you can have that break.
And we're not in control.
Yeah.
And so many things can go wrong, and especially when we are looking forward to it, then we imagine all these worst case scenarios of missing our train, of getting sick, of losing our passport, and I can totally relate to that.
I was talking to a friend the other week who went on holiday, and she's a seasoned traveller, but she got to a destination in some remote place in a country far away, and they're like, oh, we don't have your reservation for the accommodation, your travel agent, or something had gone wrong from the travel agent's perspective. And so it's kind of like, all right, I am very far from home, and now I do not have a place to sleep. How do I deal with this?
Yes. Yeah, and I remember I arrived in Dubai. It was my first travel after the lockdown. And I couldn't sleep 2 nights before, and I used to travel a lot.
Yeah.
So I lost totally the muscle of traveling. And then I arrived in Dubai without any cash on me. My credit card doesn't work, and my debit cards don't work. That was kind of stressful.
Completely.
It eventually all worked out, but this idea of being trapped somewhere.
And it's that thing of change and lack of control, loss of control, and uncertainty.
Yeah.
It's sort of this, really stressful thing for people.
So bringing all of this back to the corporate or to the organizational context, what does it then mean for a successful change process?
Well, I think ultimately you've got to think about people and really imagine, the impacts on individuals. And certainly when you're planning a big change or a small change, ideally you're doing these sort of change assessments and kind of looking at what the impacts are going to be, and even down to like each individual, who's going to be impacted in what way. Is it a change to how they work? So are we maybe sort of wanting them to do what they do differently? Is it a change to who they report to? Is it a change to the team they exist in? And that kind of the day-to-day relationships that they may sort of engage with. Maybe it's new technology, and we're needing them to adapt to a very different system. And all of these things are things that happen routinely in organizations and have to happen because the external environment is changing constantly. But we do have to really think carefully of like, how do we engage people and support people through this process, and give them that sense of autonomy and direction and participation. Yeah.
And I'm just thinking that how cool would it be, and then coming back to what we discussed earlier, whether to prepare an organization and the employees for change versus ripping the Band-Aid off. When I imagine that I know that a change will come, and then I have time to actually think for myself or align or brainstorm with my colleagues, what is for me the best response to this change? So for instance, if I have to report to a different person, so having time to reflect, okay, what did I actually learn from reporting to this other person? What is the opportunity? What do I want to change? And how can I benefit from that?
Yeah.
If I have to change location or whatsoever.
And it's tricky because there's so many different ways you can approach a change. And on the one hand, you want to give people plenty of notice and kind of rip the band-aid off so that it's kind of like, all right, well, this is what the future's going to look like. At the same time, if you haven't done enough preparation and you go in and say, okay, this is what we're doing, and it's like, well, people will have all these questions, and if you don't have answers to those questions, that can make it even worse. So you're creating more uncertainty. So you've got to really get the balance right in exploring, you know, what do we want the people that we work with to think and feel, and when is the appropriate time to, like, recognizing that there will be some negative emotions and there will be some challenging experiences. When do we actually orchestrate that at the best time?
And how to also accompany or facilitate the process for the leaders. Because I'm thinking back what you said, initiating change is very easy, it's not hurtful because we're in control. So leadership, those who have decided on the change, in the best case, for them it's all easy. So how to create empathy in them to actually help the organization and the employees go through that change?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's always easy for leaders. Like, obviously, it's easier for them to be sort of sitting back and making decisions, but there's a lot of leaders who struggle with disappointing people or struggle with some of those really difficult conversations, and rightly so. Like, that's probably one of the hardest parts of a leader's job. And so that's kind of, I think, another element that has to be managed and facilitated to make sure that you know, it's looked after. But I think it's really important for leaders to be present and really understand, like, what their people are thinking and feeling. I think when you see changes that are done where maybe the decision makers are not very engaged in the workforce, doesn't usually go well. you often find, like, probably a bit more change resistance because the people are like, well, you know, these people who are making decisions don't know what's actually happening to us or what we're experiencing. How can they make these decisions? So always, I think the number one thing is for leaders to be out there, and even if it's difficult. There was a leader that I worked with a few years ago where this was just as the pandemic was hitting, and basically we tried a number of times to do this kind of town hall concept. Like, we used to have probably once a quarter, we'd invite all the staff into a big auditorium, and, you know, there were, I don't know, like 600 to 1,000 staff that would get invited each time. Probably about 300 turn up on a good day. So they're pretty big events. And we also had different kind of campuses, so we'd be trying to work out how we engage them. You know, there was an office in Vietnam, and there were sort of others around Australia, and so we were trying to work out, like, okay, can we live stream to them? And we'd bring in all this IT assistance to kind of make it work, and so often it wouldn't. But then the pandemic hits, and this leader is like, all right, we've got a lot of questions, people are really uncertain about what's happening, and they don't know, like, you know, we don't really know what's going on, but we just have to be present, we have to be visible, we have to go out and talk to people. And no one's allowed to leave their homes, so we're going to have to do this online. And, like, I don't think any of us had really heard of Zoom before. It was at that time in the world, and so I was just thinking, like, how are we going to do this? Like, we've tried to do this kind of thing of live streaming in different locations before with all the AV support available, and it's just not been very good. And you want to do this in 2 days with no IT help to 600 individuals from your living room. Are you insane? Like, and so we just kind of made it work. We kind of jumped in. Thankfully, you know, the organisation had a Microsoft Teams license that was kind of still being rolled out. But we got on, we did this broadcast, and had open Q&A. And so we had, like, hundreds of people with the ability to write in questions anonymously if they wanted to. And we published every single one. We did not moderate. And we were really clear on that. We're like, we're not hiding anything. We are here to answer your questions. Whatever emotion you have, like, hopefully you'll be kind and respectful, but ultimately, if you're in a bad mood, that's going to come through.
And wow, so there's so much to unpack. When you say you didn't moderate it, what I hear is you didn't censor it.
Yeah.
And with 300 people in the space, how, from a facilitation perspective, how did you go about it? And did you have these raging voices? How did you deal with all these emotions?
It was tricky. we I think initially sort of started off with a bit of a script, and so we had, okay, here's the key messages, here's the presentation that we want to deliver, so here's what we know, and then we just went into open Q&A. And that worked really well. Like, we didn't have kind of people jumping on, yelling. It was all the Q&A was through chat, which was beneficial. But as I said, we published every single question that came in, and so we were in the moment kind of reading the responses, and this leader that I was working with did it brilliantly. Like, she would see what was coming in and go, you know, if there was a particularly pointed one, you know, she'd go, I can really hear the frustration in this question, and I totally understand it, and just have this moment of acknowledging the emotion that was there. It was extraordinary. And afterwards, like, there were messages pouring in saying, well, thank you, first of all, but also, like, that was really brave. Like, it's you know, I think pretty unusual that you do have a leader that is so comfortable and confident just to throw themselves to the wolves and go, I'm just going to have to deal with this because that's what my role is.
Yeah.
I have to assure these people, and whatever that takes, I'm going to do it. It was amazing.
And I wonder what there is to learn from this. It was an exceptional situation which called for an exceptional response. And what holds us back? Well, the question is, did this continue after the pandemic? Or because what holds us back, or what holds organizations back, to have a similar compassionate response to emotional reactions to change under more normal circumstances?
Yeah, well, we actually kept doing these events every single week, like every, usually Thursday for an hour, and it became like a variety show. And so my job as the communications manager suddenly had shifted. I mean, we were still doing newsletters and still doing, you know, all the normal comm stuff that we did, but it suddenly turned into like TV production. And so each week I was working with all these different people to curate an hour variety show where we'd have different guests, and we had, like, you know, someone come in and do a musical performance, which was amazing. And then a few weeks later, the guy who did the musical performance got injured and passed away, and so then we had to, like, facilitate this kind of grieving process, and we brought in a counsellor and we talked about kind of all of that, and you know, it was insane, like the sorts of experiences we worked through together in this like quasi TV show.
It's corporate group therapy.
It absolutely was. And I mean, as well, at a time when everyone was stuck at home in lockdown, we had people saying that was like the hour every week that they looked forward to the most.
Wow.
Because they felt connected to their colleagues, they felt informed by their leader, and it was a little break from the mundane.
That's beautiful. And how can when I think of a town hall, I think of all these people sitting in rows watching the stage. And the equivalent in Zoom would be everyone just being there in a big plenary looking at the leader as one of the tasks. Did you use any breakouts or anything to connect the audience, or was it really we're all in this one room together and go through this?
In these ones, we didn't have kind of like random people dialing. It was fairly managed from that perspective, but we did have open chat. So the chat function kind of became how everyone was communicating. And so, you know, you'd have, I don't know, the leader would get on and be like, hang on, I'm having some tech difficulties. Can everyone hear me? And then suddenly everyone's like, yeah, we can hear you, and all these messages are coming in. There'd be, you know, questions posted live, and you know, if someone shared something that he particularly liked, they'd go, oh wow, that's amazing. Like, there was actually this dialogue that just existed between the presenters and the audience.
And that's beautiful, because it's hard to imagine that actually something with such a big group can be so engaging. And I think it might even be more engaging than a in-person town hall, because everyone is sitting basically in the first row.
Yeah, absolutely.
and have the same opportunity to engage and participate as everyone else.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And I mean, I think, I've moved on from that organisation. I think the leader who I worked with has as well. And now, we're out of COVID and like, perhaps the need for that has changed, but I still think that kind of model has a lot of value. I think bringing people together in the good times, when it's not just about like a big change or a big restructure or some kind of thing that's pushing us to do differently, having those moments of human connection just pay off so much more when you do have hard announcements or hard things to work through. Because if you've got that trust in the organisation already, it pays dividends when the tough times are there.
Yeah, love that. And at the same time, I wonder, what is it? So, what's the difference between a change that's put upon us and basically affects everyone at the same time? COVID, the leaders were as surprised and helpless as the employees, and they had to step up to really show leadership. So it was an opportunity for them that maybe many missed.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. And then there are change processes that are planned. The organization, for instance.
Yeah.
What is the difference in terms of facilitating the change for the organization? Yeah.
I mean, I guess the difference is that ideally, with a planned change, you've got time to plan. There were a lot of changes that I worked on in previous organisations and previous roles where you'd have a particular restructure, perhaps. Maybe there's going to be a new function created, and that's going to kind of mean a few people will need to move around, and there'll need to be some new skills and some new responsibilities and new roles and lots of different things. And there was one that I worked on in particular where it was a very long process from a planning perspective, because we kind of had this roadmap of, all right, we've got to get to this point where we're creating one new division, but in the lead up to that, we've got to land all these other things first, because if we haven't delivered these things, we won't be able to get to that final goal. And I mean, that was kind of great from a change management planning perspective to understand what that final goal was, because it meant that at every step of the way, we could be trying to build unity. And with every little change that happened, and there were changes to systems and changes to, I mean, we were looking at kind of the agreement that underpinned employment for everyone. Like that was a huge change by itself. But trying to work through all of these different discrete changes in a way that helped contribute to achieving that final one was amazing. And so rarely you get that kind of lead up and vision and plan.
And it sounds as if everything would just kind of flow. You know where you want to go, and then by backward induction, you know exactly what the next step is. And then you deal with humans.
Yeah.
So,
which is a tricky bit.
So I imagine you have all this plan laid out, which could be a waterfall model, and still you have to be agile in every implementation step, because everything that you implement will, by definition, have impact on the organization and change the next step.
Completely. And at every step there were things that jumped out that were just like, oh, I didn't see that coming. Where did that come from? And I think that's just part of being in an organisation. You would be working normally and still have those things happen, right? Like without that kind of, we need to move in this direction, there's always going to be stuff that will happen that will kind of be the curveball that you need to respond to. They probably feel a little bit bigger when you've got that plan of like, this is where we need to go. Suddenly there's things that are pushing us off track. When it's just normal time, like that sort of thing isn't probably as big an issue.
So how do you facilitate then the stakeholder management, basically?
There's so many elements. I think being as open and transparent with people is so important. Because, I mean, some leaders are good performers, but like most people can kind of sniff when they're not maybe being as honest or open as they could be. So we do need to make sure that we're being real with people. And particularly when like there's a lot of organisations and businesses that have certain like legal requirements where freedom of information there can be requests that go, actually, I want all the detail on this. And so if you work in one of those spaces, like you've got to be honest with people because they can actually ask for the data and the documents. So I'd say that that's one of the key ones. I think it's really important, we talked about before, kind of actually recognising what's not changing and kind of giving people some clarity around what's going to be the same and what they can continue to expect.
And expectation management.
Yeah.
I'd like to jump on that, especially in the light of what is the best communication channel, and a town hall is usually very unidirectional or with some questions. Could be a nice format for some. Sometimes maybe more of a workshop and group work program could be another one. But then this might raise expectations of how involved is everyone actually.
Yeah.
So what are the moments that it would make sense to really include those who are affected and give them a voice versus maybe not giving them a voice because they cannot change anything anyway?
Yeah. I mean, we've done a bit of change training in my current project actually, where we have talked about it and gone, in any change there are things you can control. And like the number one is whether you work there or not. Like in most cases, if there's a change to a system, you can go, well, screw this, I'm going to go work somewhere else, and that's something that we all can control, you know. But I think trying to kind of I think engaging people is important. People need information, they need answers, and they, you know, it just comes down to respect. You know, if you respect your people, you need to provide these things. And so trying to work out how do we actually explore this in a way that is going to allow people to feel as though they've been properly engaged and they have the right information in the right direction. A lot of people don't want to be involved in creating what's next. They just want to have that clear guideline of here's what we're going to do and why. And if people have that information, you know, I think things tend to go a bit more smoothly.
Yeah.
We have had, interestingly as well, you know, and I won't go into details on my current project, but we've been sort of thinking about how do we engage people in this like post-COVID world, because 2-3 years ago, if there was a big change, you'd bring everyone into a room and you'd have a leader get up, they'd do a presentation, you would say any questions, and then afterwards you'd sort of have this like care plan, I suppose. And so if it was a particularly difficult change, you'd probably have a counsellor on site to kind of talk to people. You'd be able to see the body language, so you'd be probably able to tell maybe which people were finding it a bit complex or a bit difficult. You'd be able to see them in the office the next day and go, how are you feeling? Like, how are you processing this information? Do you have any questions? The challenge now is that like a lot of people are working from home. There's a real hybrid environment. And so we're trying to think about like, what does caring for people look like now? Like if we can't see them and say, you're looking a bit tired or you're looking a bit stressed, like, is there something I can do to help? If we can't actually identify that live in real time, because if you call someone on a Zoom call or they're expecting the call, you know, it's a little bit hard to be maybe genuine in how you're feeling.
And also it requires a lot of psychological safety and or courage to express, to ask maybe the question that you're really interested in, or to express your disappointment, frustration, sadness, anxiety. So it's so easy to hide at home, coming back to what we talked about initially.
And I like those release moments are so important. Like, you know, remember that workshop we did probably 2 weeks ago with Michelle, where there's a big community infrastructure project happening. It's going to be really good in the long run, but mean heaps of disruption in the short term. And Michelle, you know, her beautiful workshop plan was like, all right, how do we create or work out where these like pressure release moments are, where we've got a really passionate community who are really, really concerned, and rightly so, about what's possibly going to happen. But we're not going to have a constructive conversation if it's all about emotion.
Yeah.
We have to acknowledge the emotion, and we have to work with it, and it needs to be there. But we also need to be able to look past that and work out like what are our priorities of the community, and actually working out how you facilitate those pressure releases is really valuable and really important.
And I remember, and I think it's interesting for the audience how we work together in this kind of experience of the participants of this workshop as they came in, and some of them were really angry when they came in.
Yeah.
And you were the first point of contact, kind of welcoming them.
Would you like a sandwich? the look on their faces changed immediately.
Yeah, free food always works.
Yeah.
And then they came, and I think you prepared them that there will be a point that they can already share their point of view.
Yeah.
And then they came to my station, air quotes, where I offered them a pen and paper to put their voice and their opinion and their anger on the wall. And remember, some of them said, I better don't do that because my opinion won't be appreciated. And I smiled at them and said, please do, yes, it will be appreciated. Now is the time.
Yeah.
And they were kind of so caught off guard, like, what?
Yeah.
I cannot be angry, but it's okay. It's okay to be angry.
Yeah. I mean, I remember one of my first jobs was in retail, and you'd have someone come in because the product they bought hadn't met their expectations. And they walked in like they were looking for a fight. And when you listened to them, oh, that sounds really annoying, you kind of, there was this look of surprise, and then you actually helped them, and there was kind of like, oh, thank you. And then they walked out with a smile. And, you know, people just need to be listened to and have how they're feeling acknowledged and allowed to be legitimate.
Yeah. I think as long as they are taken seriously.
Yeah. I
think the worst is that you smile at them like, oh yeah, it's all okay, but actually you're not with them, not genuinely. And I don't know whether it's related, but a thought that came up in our conversation now a couple of times, that change somehow is also related with this deep anxiety of not being good enough.
Yeah.
So if I was good enough, then nothing will have to change. So if I'm affected, or if something has to change, or if I have to change, it means that it's not good enough yet.
Yeah.
And how do we acknowledge that? Because I think it's something that we rarely speak about, and it's one of those anxieties we all have as a human species, and it comes up in change.
Completely. Like all those insecurities that we all just carry around, when there is a change happening, like they all bubble up to the top. And yeah, totally. When I've worked on a number of changes where we've really thought like, okay, we're trying to propose this difference in the organisation, and maybe it's like a new system or something. And it's like, we're not telling people that everything they do is wrong and that we, you know, don't love their work and we don't appreciate them. We absolutely do. We really need them in this organisation and they bring a lot of value. But we do need to do this differently for a whole bunch of different reasons. There was one change that I was involved in, working with some really amazing change managers at a university, where the university was deciding to bring in a new learning management system. And so this is the system that every single student and every single staff member uses for everything. Like, it was just huge. Or it should have been the system they used for everything. We knew that some were kind of working around it. And so, like, that's a huge change process. And not only were we getting people onto a new system, but we also wanted them to use it in the same way. And that was difficult because everyone had a different teaching style and everyone had a different communication style. And there was a lot of value in that. But at the same time, we knew from our students that that was really annoying, because every time they started a new subject, there was this whole different way of learning that they had to adapt to. And this, like, you know, the information that was in one place for one subject is in a different place for another subject.
And at universities, you have the freedom of teaching that every professor is taking advantage of, that they are allowed to do it their way.
Exactly.
How did you deal with that?
it was tricky. And I think that was probably one of the biggest challenges. And it wasn't to say that like the teachers weren't doing a great job. We knew that there were really good learning experiences happening, but we were just trying to create some consistency so that there was a little bit less noise for the students, so that the student experience was a little bit more simplified, and you know, ultimately so that the students had a better time. Like, we wanted them to not be so encumbered by the trying to navigate a new subject and instead be focused on what they were there to learn.
Yeah. And I have a question, and before I ask it, Gordon, please cut that out. Shall we check why this is not moving?
Yeah, maybe we start.